We thought that there was a need in different areas of the world to discuss both the legal myths having to do with business in the United States and some cultural issues as well. And in the course of discussing the collaboration, I was asked by Sophie and her partner, where do you think we should go first? And it took me less than 2 seconds to say Finland. And they said, okay, why Finland? I said, here are the reasons. Finland, at least in my view, has the finest public education system in the world, which is producing great scientists and engineers. Number two, Finland has an enormous respect for the development and protection of intellectual property. Three, Finland has an increasing concentration of entrepreneurs who are interested in taking this technology that's coming out of Finland and monetizing it, not just in Finland, but elsewhere in the world. Why should you come to the U.S.? Again, this repeats some of the points, but it's really well worth it. And by the way, we haven't spoken to each other. We didn't coordinate our presentation. These are observations that we each reached independently of each other. Number one, it's the premier location for new business investment, no doubt about that. We have a GDP of $18.6 trillion, that's per capita $56,000. We have a population in our country of 320 million people, and under our free trade agreements, which are going to continue to survive in some respect, we have access to 250 million more consumers for your goods and services. So that's almost 600 million potential customers that you have when you come to the U.S. Like Finland, we have a well-educated citizenry. Of the top 20 world universities, 16 of them are located in the United States. We have a substantial system, both at the federal level and different state levels and even local levels, of tax incentives, such as tax credits for businesses that come and establish themselves there. We have a respect for intellectual property and a very strong enforcement regime. I did notice in preparing for this that in one ranking, Finland is number one for intellectual property enforcement. The U.S. is number 2 or number 3. But clearly we are kindred spirits when it comes to the development and protection of intellectual property. At least as of 2 weeks ago, we have a stable democracy, and I do expect that we will continue to have a stable democracy for the next 4 years. The accessibility to investment is unparalleled, as Rick said, but even now, most of the investors that I come in touch with, and we have a very, very large venture practice at our law firm, they require or prefer that their portfolio companies have a U.S. presence. And as the U.S. Department of Commerce has noted, you can't become truly global without having a U.S. presence. Businesses operating in small markets, and certainly Finland is a small market, can become large and dynamic firms by coming to the United States. Basically, we want you. We want you, we want your enthusiasm, we want your expertise, we want your technology, we want your dreams, we want your ideas. And we are a very welcoming place, as Rick pointed out, for companies from Finland who, in order to globalize, understand you got to go outside Finland because it's a very small marketplace. And I would suggest to you that the most critical place for you to be is in the United States. What is the bottom line? The bottom line is that we are a very fertile area for expansion of the business. All right, now we segue into the presentation. There are legal landmines that you can encounter if you come to the U.S., but as I will demonstrate to you, these can be eliminated or controlled, substantially controlled, through a careful entry plan. That's what I'm going to be talking to you about. There are cultural problems that you can encounter if you're unaware of them. There are big differences between the Finnish culture and the Finnish personality and the American culture and the American personality, and Sophie is going to be addressing those, and I think you'll find it fairly fascinating. And just to presage, one thing that she's going to talk about, and I want to make this point because it's really important and it's frequently overlooked by businesses and executives from other countries, is that the United States is not a homogeneous society. We are roughly, I guess, 3,000 miles from coast to coast, probably 2,000 miles from Minnesota to Texas. But within the United States, there are many different cultures. There are many different ways in which people conduct business. You ought not to walk into a business meeting, for example, in my office in Rockefeller Center in New York City, and conduct yourself the same way you would as if, for example, you were going to walk into my brother's office in Birmingham, Alabama, or a cousin's office in Idaho. It's very different. And one of the keys, as Sophie will point out to you, to being successful is knowing in advance what these differences are and what the local business customs and social customs are in the area in which you are going to be having your meeting and business negotiations. But none of these landmines and none of these cultural differences ought to discourage you from coming to the U.S. to take advantage of all of those attributes that Rick discussed and then which I reiterated. Basically, the message is keep calm and avoid the landmines because they are avoidable. Now, here are some myths about doing business in the United States. The cost of entry is tremendous, and that's really prohibitive. Forming a business in the U.S. takes a very long period of time. The U.S. is anti-immigrant. There are too many regulations that make it difficult to grow a business in the U.S., especially small businesses. The U.S. is too litigious, too much litigation. Patent trolls, and I'm going to get into this in a little bit of detail toward the end, are too big a threat to us. We don't want to subject ourselves to that threat. These myths are easily debunked, refuted by the facts when you roll up your sleeves and examine them. The cost of entry, a subsidiary or affiliate can be fully formed in the U.S. for less than $5,000. How long does it take to form a business? We can do it, not that we're special about this, in 24 to 48 hours. Frequently, the state of incorporation or formation is Delaware. A bunch of reasons for that. Are we anti-immigrant? No. Of the total population, there are 42 million foreign-born U.S. residents. That's 13% of the population. Are there too many regulations? Well, foreign companies have invested $3.1 trillion in the U.S. They employ almost 6.5 million Americans, have an annual payroll of $500 million, and spend $50 billion annually on U.S. research and development. I believe Rick alluded to the Foreign Investment and National Security Act. The door is open to companies who are going to come to America and make the kinds of contributions that we yearn for. Too litigious? Well, while litigation may be slightly increasing generally, and a lot of this is personal injury litigation and slip and fall and stuff like that, there are new rules that have been adopted uniformly throughout the federal courts as well as all the state courts to reduce frivolous litigation and also to encourage the parties to resolve their differences early on without the necessity of incurring large legal fees and disruption to their businesses. And patent troll suits, as I'll show you, can be effectively handled by careful planning. Now I want to just stop for a second. This word is going to come up again and again and again throughout my presentation. I am a big fan of planning. There was a famous Roman orator named Publius Serius who, according to the literature, said, "Without a plan, there is chaos." And that really, in a way, has been one of my guiding principles, particularly with my clients. Without a plan, there will be chaos. The key to being successful in the United States is collaborating with your trusted advisors and developing an entry plan that you can execute efficiently when you reach our shores. Without a plan, which is developed before you come, your likelihood of success diminishes. All right, it's time to do business in the U.S. Let's talk about avoiding the landmines. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I love this chart because it talks about the methods of entry into the U.S. by non-U.S. entities. You see the axis. You have extent of investment risk on the left, the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, you have degree of ownership and control. If you're just exporting your goods or services here, you know, low investment risk, low degree of ownership and control, typically low reward. And as you go up this hierarchy, licensing, franchising, strategic alliances, joint ventures, wholly owned subsidiaries, while the extent of the investment risk goes up and while the degree of ownership and control becomes very high, the probability of reward becomes greater. And I think that this chart, which I certainly did not make up, expresses this very, very well. Now, what are the major legal risks of doing business in the United States? You have a risk of commercial liability, personal injury liability, regulatory violations, employee-related claims, intellectual property claims, the possibility of losing your intellectual property rights, data privacy violations, which you in Europe actually are much more sensitive to than we are in the United States. Litigation is a risk. Tax consequences need to be considered. We have a complex set of immigration laws and regulations that you need to navigate. One of the major concerns of the many clients who I've brought into the country, into the U.S., including from Finland, is the risk of what we call imputed liability. You may know it as transferee liability or upstream liability. How do we protect the foreign parent, or for that matter, the foreign parent's intellectual property rights from being exposed to liabilities for something that has occurred in the United States? There is a risk of officer and director liability. I can assure you that all of these risks can be significantly controlled, and indeed, many of them can be totally eliminated. How? Through careful planning. And that's the message that I want you to carry out of here, at least from my presentation. Let's just go through some of them. You can control some of these legal risks just by the way in which you form your business. You have to select the best business structure. There are ways to do it, a subsidiary, a sub-subsidiary, other ways to insulate your parent in Finland from upstream liability. You can place your intellectual property. And this is very interesting. There was a survey done not too long ago of the top 2,000 companies in the world. And of the top 2,000 companies in the world, over 90% of the asset value of each of those companies was in intellectual property, not in hard assets. So one of the things we can do is we can place your IP in a different company. We can produce different licensing agreements. We have to consider the tax perspectives. You have to identify where you need to qualify to do business. If you form yourself in Delaware, which is what most folks do, and you happen to maintain an office, let's say, in California, then you would have to qualify to transact business in California. But that is a fairly simple ministerial procedure. And of course, you have to obtain the necessary licenses and permits. For most goods and services, this is not a big deal. If you're bringing in foodstuffs, there are more regulatory constraints that you have to deal with. If you're going to be bringing in AK-47s, there are even more regulatory constraints. You can control a lot of the legal risks, avoid the landmines through a properly developed program of insurance. As a matter of fact, what I consider myself as, even though I'm a lawyer, is I'm, in a way, a risk manager. By doing all these things for my Finnish clients, and by the way, I brought a number of Finnish clients into the U.S., some have been successful, some have not, we are controlling risks. And it can be done through various types of insurance coverage. I'm not suggesting all of these are required for every Finnish company that comes to the U.S., but certainly some of them are. We can control the risk of employer liability. There is a lot of litigation that goes on in the U.S. between employers and employees who have been terminated or who claim they've been discriminated against. We have sexual harassment and discrimination in hiring, firing, workplace conditions. There's the wrongful termination or denial of benefits. These claims arise under federal, state, and sometimes even city laws and can result in damages, attorney's fees, punitive damages, requirement that you reinstate the employee who's been terminated. We have a whole bunch of federal anti-discrimination statutes with substantial penalties for violations. This is nothing for you to be afraid of. All of these risks can be controlled through careful planning, and I would suggest to you that some of these risks can be totally eliminated. So there's the debunking of yet another myth. And there are other ways to reduce employer liability. You have to understand the rules of the road, including immigration laws, employee handbook. We provide sexual harassment training for all our clients. That doesn't mean training them on how to sexually harass their employees. But that's an important component because it reduces the likelihood of there being claims, and it also can almost eliminate the possibility of there being a punitive damages claim against an employer where, in fact, there has been some wrongful conduct, and so on. We can control the risks of commercial liability, defective goods, services, and so forth. The sales of goods, which include software, are covered by state statutes You know, we have a federalist system, so you have a whole body of federal laws, and then each state has its own body of state law. And typically, commercial matters are relegated under our Constitution to the states to regulate. All states except one have adopted a statute called the Uniform Commercial Code. Now, what that does for folks who are knowledgeable, it tells you how to draft agreements for your clients, which will significantly reduce the likelihood of liability and also significantly reduce and frequently eliminate the exposure to substantial damages if you've sold goods which are allegedly defective. And those sales also may be governed by the United Nations Convention on the International Sale of Goods. I believe Finland is a signatory to that, if I'm not mistaken. And that also governs the sale of goods between two countries who are signatories, happen to be Finland and the United States. But that, too, has within it certain drafting techniques where, if knowledgeable, we can eliminate or substantially reduce the risk of exposure to damages. Some states have additional laws that cover services transactions. My guess is that in some material respects, this body of law is different than what you have here in Finland. All contracts should be drafted or reviewed, I suggest, by knowledgeable lawyers, not because I'm a lawyer, but because I've seen what the consequences are when it's done carelessly. And it's very much within our culture that all contracts and agreements are in writing. It's important that you protect your intellectual property, and once more, I use the word plan. That's really important. What's your intellectual property plan? If you are coming to the U.S., how are you going to protect your intellectual property, and how are you going to be assured, to the extent possible, that you're not going to be infringing somebody else's intellectual property rights, perhaps patent rights, or trademark rights, or copyright rights? And there are a variety of ways to do it. I've been doing this for 40 years. By seeking patent protection, building a trade secret program, registering your copyrights and trademarks. You certainly have to have confidentiality and invention agreements with employees and consultants and so on. All part of an intellectual property protection plan. You also have to protect against related claims. You may want to obtain a freedom to operate opinion, which means you want to come to the U.S. and be assured you're not going to be infringing anybody else's patents. You want to make sure your trademark is available for use in the U.S. and so on and so on. And some companies, just give me one second, some companies, in fact, even get intellectual property infringement insurance. Yes, sir?
I mean, basically, patents, if they are being granted internationally, globally, they will be subject to the attacks, regardless whether the company owning them has any operations in the U.S. So what changes if we would, for example, go to the U.S., still having the IP in a Finnish company?
If I understand the question correctly, he talks about intellectual property being, patents being prosecuted internationally, and what the consequence is of that. I may be oversimplifying it. Patents are territorial in nature. A U.S. patent cannot be enforced overseas. An overseas patent cannot be enforced in the U.S. For reasons that go back to concepts of sovereign immunity and sovereignty, patents are just territorial in nature. I know what you're going to say. There are patent recognition treaties, and other ways in which foreign patents can be recognized in the U.S. But this whole area of international patent protection, again, is one that needs to be looked at as part of the plan that we're talking about. Rick alluded to this. Are your goods or services regulated? What regulatory bodies have jurisdiction? What labeling requirements are there? We've done a lot of work with Finnish companies with labeling requirements. Here are some of the federal commissions that exercise regulatory authority over goods that are imported. And in addition, many of the states have their own regulatory authorities. Landmines, yes. Navigable, absolutely navigable. All right, so there we go. Now let me just conclude by talking about patent troll infringement claims. All right, what is a patent troll? It's typically a company funded by investors that acquire patents just to make claims of infringement against large and small companies. They never practice the invention. They have no intention on practicing the invention. It's purely an investment, typically by a hedge fund, in a patent troll. And the business imperative is the patent troll will send out dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of letters to companies saying, for example, Rick, we have reason to believe that your company is violating our patent number 7362514. We are prepared to discuss a licensing arrangement with you in order to avoid litigation. Well, we know that patent litigation in the U.S. is very expensive. If I told you how expensive it is, it would make you throw up. But I'm not going to do that because I don't want you throwing up during my presentation. But the economic imperative is, okay, if it's going to cost me $100,000, this is just a hypothetical, in license fees to get rid of this, instead of having to spend $1 million in legal fees, whether I think there's a valid claim or not, I'll pay $100,000, as extortionate as it may be. That's the business imperative on the side of the patent troll. And I'll talk about that shortly. They're known as NPEs, PAEs. Those are the best known patent trolls. And I have a couple of statistics here. Probably the last sentence is the most significant. The top 10 filers of patent infringement suits were these patent trolls or NPEs or PAEs. But there are even ways to deal with this. This is not a deterrent for you to come to the U.S. and to exploit the advantages that we think we offer to Finnish companies that are seeking to globalize. These are just, and I'll let you run down the slide, these are just techniques that we have found successful in dealing with patent trolls. A lot of this patent troll litigation, by the way, is brought in Texas, in the eastern portion of Texas. It's called the Eastern District of Texas. Patent trolls find that to be a very hospitable jurisdiction. And we have, not only us, but many major law firms have very substantial patent practices in Texas, and particularly in the Eastern District of Texas. One thing here, I'd like to go to the last bullet point. This was part of the America Invents Act, which was signed by President Obama within a month of his first inauguration, and it opened up a whole variety of ways to challenge the validity of a patent that's being asserted against you. To understand, just because the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office has issued a patent doesn't mean ipso facto that that patent is valid and enforceable. There are a whole host of reasons why the patent may not be valid and enforceable. And of course, in dealing with patent trolls, one of the things you have to consider is whether you can make an argument, well, if you come after me, if we can't resolve this to my satisfaction, I am going to challenge the validity of those patents that you're asserting, either in litigation or in one or more patent office proceedings that have been made available as a result of this American Invents Act. These are other ways, of course, that you can discourage the type of patent troll claims that we have been talking about. The bottom line is this a landmine? Should we be afraid of this? The answer is absolutely not. Any company that thinks it has strong technology, that thinks it can globalize by taking advantage of the marketplace that the U.S. offers, in no way ought to be discouraged by the existence of patent troll litigation. It is not likely even that you would ever have to face this situation. But if you do, it's a situation which typically we and others can deal with on a reasonable business basis. What is the bottom line here? My bottom line is the same as Rick's bottom line. The U.S. offers broad and rich business opportunities for Nordic companies. While doing business in the U.S. carries legal risks, of course it does. Many of the risks of doing business can be significantly controlled, and others can be totally eliminated. I promise you that. Through, here I go again, careful planning and execution. Without a plan, there is chaos. As one of our founding fathers said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. My view of this is that we should be, should be practicing preventive law, much like preventive medicine. Let's take care of these problems before they arise. Let's control these risks. Let's carefully plan for the entry of my Finnish company into the U.S. by following not necessarily all of what I outlined, because it's rare that every Finnish company who comes to the U.S. would need all this stuff done. But part of what we would need to do together is to assess your business, assess your objectives, assess your history, assess your business plan, assess your assets, and develop a plan that will give you a soft landing.
Sarah Aalto, who's competing in the X Factor in the UK, the reason I mention her is you may not have, if you've heard of her, but if you may not have heard the judge introduce her on one of the shows. Sarah Aalto, all the way from Norway. I'm sure that has to be a little irritating for you guys. And then the other judge said, no, it's not Norway, it's Finland. You know, Scandinavia. So anyway, that's the kind of lack of awareness of Finland that is the case around the world. And this is the UK, so pretty close to you, you know, trading partner. You would expect them to know a little bit better. So imagine in the US. In fact, I dug this out. Los Angeles Times even got this wrong. So, but how can that be when we've heard all these things about Finland and we know that there is so much that Finland has to offer? Why isn't everybody, you know, coming over or doing business with Finland? So yes, Granted, other than the cold, there's all these things, and we've already, we've heard, you know them, and Mark has been over them. And then all these successful companies all over the world. I bet you most people around the world who take an elevator, that's got to be a large proportion of the world population, don't know that it's a Finnish-made product. I know I used scissors for many years, had no idea. That being the case, why isn't everybody coming over or knowing more? And I would venture to say it's the culture, because you guys know better than me that in the Finnish culture, it's really not common to put yourself forward, to say you have a great country, a great company, that you have all these qualities. Of course, we Americans are very okay with that. We're very comfortable saying, all these things about ourselves. So I think historically, there really hasn't been a lot of promotion of Finland. Of course, with FinPro and all these organizations, things are changing. But historically, I believe that's the case, and so there's not a lot of knowledge of Finland. Looking from a business perspective, more globally, this is not about Finland, this is just globally across all types of business deals. There's good news and bad news. Bad news is 50 to 70% of deals, depending on which studies you look at, this has been documented, deals that fall through for culture and communication problems. And you may think that the person that you're talking to and about to sign a contract with decided not to for a clause that they didn't like, or spec that they didn't want to include, or some supply chain, or something concrete. But it's been proven that 50 to 70% of the time, it's really not that. It's really a cultural issue. And that's why I call it the silent killer, because so many deals, and this has been verified by so many people I've talked to, so many deals just die and you don't know why it was. The good news, however, is that you can actually turn these cultural differences into a competitive advantage. But as Mark was saying, it's all about planning. In this case, it's a lot about awareness. So what I would like, so really starting to talk about culture, and I think one of the biggest issues with these cultural differences and tripping up people is that nobody really knows what it is. It's a very amorphous concept. So I want to just give you a little bit of an overview, very simple ways to think about this and understand what it is. I use an iceberg. It's a very common analogy for cultural, the whole understanding of culture, and we're here in Finland, so you're probably pretty familiar with icebergs. But the point is, only 10% of an iceberg is visible. And this is what you see: literature, dance, visual arts, even religion, humor. But there are so many more aspects to culture, and those are the ones that really trip us up. As you go down, under the sea level, you have things like eye contact, modesty, what are the concepts of beauty, or things like that. And then the deeper you go, the more subconscious they are, and the more emotionally charged they are. So the more they impact your behavior, your perceptions, and that's where you really get tripped up. There have been quite a few models written up about how to think about culture. What I want to do is show you one that's really simple, visual, and easy to remember. So anywhere you go, you will, hopefully I will indelibly mark you with these images. I think it's very easy to remember, and when you're talking to someone, you'll be able to visualize this in your head and get a little insight into what you may be dealing with. So this is the Richard Lewis model, and what he has said is that based on over 200,000 interviews in 68 countries, he has determined that there are three main categories of cultures. And, you know, bear in mind, these are broad categories. Everybody falls somewhere in between them, okay? But the linear active are people that are task-oriented, do things in sequence, okay? Stick to the facts, and really written sources are what they base their decisions on. Things like reports or, you know, recommendations, etc. And by the way, while I'm presenting this, try to imagine in your mind some people you know from different countries, countries you've been to, and we'll take a look in a minute how this all falls out on the globe, and you'll be able to double check what you were thinking. The second group is the multi-active group. Very loquacious, talk a lot, gesture a lot. Emotions are really important, and relationships are critical and really what drives decisions. And then you have the reactive, or I call that the listen active group. And these are people who really will listen primarily before they react and provide you with their answer. These are people who do not interrupt, do not contradict. I'm hoping at this point you're thinking about various cultures that you may have come across. So let's look what it looks like around the world. And I have a close-up of Europe in a second, so don't hurt your eyes trying to figure it out. But see, Latin America, you would have probably expected multi-active for the most part. And you see Asia really being China, Japan, Vietnam, and a lot of countries around there really being the much more listen active, quieter cultures. Let's take a look a little more closely at Europe. Somehow this slide, the red has become a little pinkish, but you still get the idea. As you see, a lot of, you know, Southern Europe, as you would have expected, is much more the multi-active. Spain, Italy, okay, you knew that. Norway, Germany, much more the linear active. What you can clearly see is Finland is a different color than all the rest of Europe, except for a little country there. But so you are going to have to deal with cultural differences regardless who you do business with. And I've heard a lot this week. Oh, I'm going to start with, you know, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, before I start thinking about going to the US because, you know, it's closer, etc. Well, distance is one thing. Legal issues are another. But culture is really critical. And as we'll see in a second, perhaps the US culture is not as different from yours than you might think, or that some of your other neighbors. So this is the Lewis model on a graph, which is, this is the one that I would like you to sort of burnish on your brains. Ooh, I guess you guys are really listening to what I'm telling you to do, to burnish it on your brain, because everybody's taking a picture of it. This is wonderful. So I will share the slides. But really, so, you know, imagine a Mexican person all the way at the top there who has to negotiate a contract with a Japanese person. I mean, the amount of cultural differences that they're going to have to surmount are huge, and the risks to their deal is huge, okay? Just looking at Finland, Sweden, I know you feel that Sweden is a very different culture from the Finnish one, and it certainly is, but still pretty close. You know, compared to Colombia. And what I wanted you to see here is how US culture is different. It's on a different axis, but we're still in the same corner, you know, we're still in the same ballpark. So what I want to do is go over some of the similarities between our cultures, things that we can build upon to drive the relationship building, and then some differences, and then we'll get to specific ways you can deal with this. One of the, there are many different, again, measures and criteria, but there's a couple that I wanted to show to you. And this is really the dimension of egalitarian versus hierarchical. I've only kept a few of the slides here, so it'll be easier to see. But you can see China, like very, very hierarchical, and Denmark at the other end of that spectrum. Finland, not far from Denmark and some of the other Nordic countries. UK too, and then US not that far. A little bit more hierarchical, but nothing dramatic. Another dimension is how risk-averse a culture is, or how comfortable with ambiguity they are. And, you know, think about, you go into a meeting, how much ambiguity are you comfortable coming into the meeting with or leaving the meeting with. So things like countries like Japan, France, very risk-averse and really need things to be structured and clear to them. I don't know what happened to the flag of Singapore, but Denmark, Singapore, cultures where really there's a lot more flexibility and openness to kind of let it, you know, see what happens. Now, where the biggest difference is on these types of measures is this, which some people refer to, well, some people, the guy who created the model, and many others refer to as feminine masculine. I don't like that terminology because it carries too many concepts and preconceptions. But I think the key point here is competitive versus cooperative. And this is one I want to spend a second on because it's really the one where I believe our cultures are the most different. So you see countries like Japan and the US, and in a competitive type of culture, people are very assertive, competitive, of course. Success is rewarded by material things. And work is just work, work, work. I mean, you know, the US, we have 2 weeks vacation, and, you know, it's amazing to me, but not everybody takes those 2 weeks. Can you believe that? You have 2 weeks vacation, and a lot of people just don't take them. And in any event, they're totally reachable on their cell phones, and they work half the time. And there's also a big difference in the gender roles in those societies. Now, on the cooperative side, you see Denmark, Finland, Norway. There's really a lot of emphasis on work-life balance, and these are much more consensus-oriented cultures. So when you start thinking about in business, what is this going to mean? Imagine a meeting, and you will hopefully be in some of those soon, meetings between US people and Finnish people. The rewards, the incentives that drive the two parties are going to be different. So this is important when you are going to hire people and have a team and all this, but think about earlier in the process, during negotiations, for example. What is going to be an important incentive for one party to negotiate with is going to be perceived differently by the other.
Excuse me if I can
yes,
say,
sure.
Comment on that. So I think quite often the challenge is if you reached a deal, and then we have the work-life balance here, and then if it's a summer holiday season, it's hard to get things done from this side, whereas things are turning on the other side. And of course, I was living in South Africa. In South Africa, it's winter, where it's here summer. So then the line of the window of opportunity to do things together, it's a bit shorter, because then they have a very long Christmas last summer vacation, and we have long summer vacation, so you have to the time windows to operate together and do something together are shorter.
Absolutely. Those are part of the things that need to be addressed, that need to be recognized, that need to be spoken of early in the process so that you can determine some norms that you can work with. As with everything, awareness is half the battle. So, yes.
Is it a legal right?
I'm sorry.
Is that a legal right for Americans?
I believe it is.
No, it's not.
No, actually, no.
It's not a legal right. It's but it's sort of a commonality that you have 2 weeks holiday. But the law actually doesn't say, the employment law doesn't say.
So it's even worse.
What is the reason people don't take it to holiday? Is it because they love their work, or are they afraid that they're going to be fired, or they need to show to the management that I really value the job and I don't take it? So
Yeah.
what's the main reason?
It's a combination of all of those, and what I would argue is that really it goes down to culture, which is the culture around employees. For historically and contextually, really emphasizes that comparison to peers, and I know when I've gone to my boss to say I'd like to take 2 weeks off to go to France, my home country, 2 weeks, like 2 weeks. That's a long time. Like, what do we, how are you going to manage your workload during that time? It's like, well, but I have 2 weeks, so why? So it's frowned upon. And that's a very sad state of affairs, but it is being perpetuated by employers, and it's beginning to change a tad, but really very, very slowly. So, yeah.
So the question,
Sure.
is it so that in some of the multinational companies, they have longer vacations still? So basically, let's say Silicon Valley, they give better perks for the employees, and they give, at least in theory, the paid holidays are longer.
Yes, there are some exceptions. Well, I wouldn't call exceptions, really more, depending on the culture. And as you said, Silicon Valley is a different culture. And I think there is some movement towards understanding that work-life balance is important. So there are pockets like California where it's a little bit better. And I have to tell you, as you go up the chain and you have a higher and higher position, you're able to negotiate more. And so the larger corporations are able to really give you a bit more. But rarely goes beyond 4 weeks. Seriously. I mean, I don't think there's any American companies that give more than 4 or 5 weeks. 4 weeks.
One more question about the sick leaves. So are the sick leaves non-paid, or are they paid, and how is the attitude towards sick leaves overall?
That depends from company to company. Many times, which is a weird concept, I have to say, when I first came to the US, I couldn't quite understand this. You have a number of sick days, and you can take them or not take them, but if you don't take them, you lose them. It's so weird. But so some companies will give you a certain number of sick days. Some you just, when you're sick, and you just bring a note or whatever after a few days. But I don't know the law really on it, but it varies.
It's to answer your question, she is right. Those policies vary from company to company. One company may give 5 sick days, another one could give 12, one could say paid, one can say unpaid. There is no uniform standard because there is no law requiring that there be a uniform standard. So in a sense, your selection also depends upon what you think you need to do to be competitive, to be able to attract the employees who you want. Part of that employee benefit, well, I would say this, more and more in the United States, one of the criteria that prospective employees look at in determining what job to take is the benefit package. And included in the benefit package broadly is the matter of sick days, vacation days, holidays. That's in addition to medical insurance coverage, which is frequently the overriding and primary consideration in determining what employment to take.
Yes.
Maybe just a quick comment. Sorry, Martin Zola from Pro Silicon Valley. So, in addition to having differences between the companies, there is also within companies there are differences because you have expats in the multinationals, so they have usually quite different benefits and vacation times than the local contracts, and then there's a lot of contract positions in the companies, and all of these are treated differently. So there's really no one way, even in a company, to do the vacation.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, when you see your expat colleagues with their 6 weeks, it could be a little frustrating. But yes, there's a lot of differences. So remember we talked about a silent killer and we talked about a sea monster and all this. I call the cultural issues a silent killer, as I've explained before. And so when I do this presentation, I like to present the aspects you need to be careful of as the tentacles of a monster under the sea. Because you could be, sailing your boat happily, but these tentacles could come and just ruin everything for you, sink your ship. But if you can see where those tentacles are, you'll be ahead of the game. So for Finland, I thought, okay, let me find a sea monster. So I turned to Kalevala, and I found one, Ekotorso. And so I was very excited. And I spoke to my Finnish friends, and they said, forget about it. Nobody's going to. So I was disappointed. But then I found another version I thought was maybe a little more recent. Perhaps some of you could relate more to that. And so that's the one I'm using, the one from the Disney Don Rosa version. So regardless whether you know or not, that's the monster you're stuck with. So 5 typical business situations that you will encounter at one point or another. The first one is interactions with people. That's, your starting point. So we'll talk about that and some of the things that you can do to bridge the gaps. Another one is meetings. Obviously, this is sort of your everyday life. So some of the things you need to be aware of. Negotiations are a critical juncture, of course, of any business dealing. So again, some things to be aware of. Then, and this is a huge subject, so I'm really only going to touch upon it, the importance of understanding your customer. And Mark has said, there's 50 different states, and then there's many different segments within the population. So that's really something to be careful of. And then the implementation once everything is done. So I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly, but the point to remember here, interactions with people, is connect. And I always say this, but here I'm going to emphasize it even more, because the Finnish culture, as we've seen, is much more reserved, and you really need to somehow or other connect with people so that you can do business. So what I thought I would do is just point out a couple of behaviors that we in the United States have, and perceptions when that behavior is not present in our business dealings, and how you could maybe handle it. Speaking up in the US is part of the genetic makeup. It's why the Americans went to America in the first place, because they wanted to have that freedom of speech. So we're very outspoken, and when we see someone who's quiet, we think they're not interested. We think they're not engaged. So it could be tricky. So what I would recommend you to do is to try, give yourself permission to be a little bit more effusive. And it may feel that you're being a little theatrical, but go for it. A little bit will go a long way. People will call you by your first name, so call them by their first name. Don't ask, just do it. Eye contact is very important. And when someone does not give us eye contact, an American may misinterpret it as being, person's a little shifty, they don't know, they're not quite trustworthy. So you don't want to take that chance that somebody would perceive you that way. So even though it's hard and maybe you're not comfortable doing eye contact, in a prolonged way, just look up and make a little effort to do that, even if it's uncomfortable. Handshake is pretty standard, I think, here in the US as well. We're not in a multi-active culture where people are going to give you hugs or really touch a lot, but there's a little bit of more touch maybe. Certainly if you go on social event, if you go bowling, go whatever, there's going to be some high fives, so just expect it. And if somebody high fives you, do high five back, even though it's very awkward. I can tell you it's more awkward to be on the giving side of a high five that is not responded to, worse than a handshake that's not responded to. The Americans smile a lot. I was thinking about this even in the breakfast room this morning, and I'm just smiling at everybody who walks in. It's just, I can't help it. It's just the way we're used to. Okay. And so when somebody doesn't smile back to us, we think that they're cold, disapproving, or they don't believe in the product. If you're pitching and you're not smiling, it's really concerning to an American. So as Nike would say, just do it a little bit, at least, once in a while. And then my last thing here is on this slide is Americans have a listen in spurts, short, they're looking for that conclusion right away. So put them at ease, give them the conclusion, what you're asking for, what you're presenting, or what you've concluded, and then you can go into the reasons and justifications. But if you go through all the reasoning before your conclusion, you will have lost your counterpart. A few little tips, I'll just show you this quickly. If a Finnish person says it's all right about, something that an American says, the American should translate that, it's good. But let me go to the second part. When an American tells you it's all right, that means it really sucks. Okay? It's terrible. They're just being polite. If an American says it's good, it's just okay. It's barely acceptable. Only when the American gets really excited, wow, this is awesome, you blew my mind, then you know that you're on the right track. All right? I'd like to talk about small talk for a minute. I think it's the elephant in the room, the one thing that I think Finnish people are the most uncomfortable with. So, I believe, tell me if I'm wrong, that the reason you guys don't like small talk, or a lot of Finnish people don't, is because it's pointless, it's superficial, it's inauthentic. So I'm going to try and give you some solutions to that. Pointless, I think the point here, sorry, no pun intended, the point here is that Americans get very uncomfortable with silence and the absence of small talk. So if you're going in a meeting with an American, you don't want them to be uncomfortable, so just give it to them. Doesn't matter what you talk about, just give it. But here's some tips to be able to give, some feedback, some small talk that you're comfortable with. If you know in advance who you're going to meet, just do a quick Google search, or even better, look on their LinkedIn profile. And just look for something, some organization that belong to anything that can give you a hook, and then you can start to talk to them about that. And with Americans, it's, you give them the hook, you don't need to worry about anything because they'll talk. So you're all set. And as the superficial and inauthentic issue, small talk doesn't have to be small. You can talk about interesting things, and I know that feels more comfortable to me. I'm sure it'd be more comfortable to you guys. So yeah, you can start by how was your flight, blah, blah, blah. But then you can go into something interesting, like what do you do when you're not working? Or what are your interests, art-wise, whatever. You'll stand out, and then you'll be talking about something interesting. So just briefly, some safe topics, some not so safe topics. Depending what you're looking for, just stay away from those. And just be prepared for the sports metaphors. And it took me, I don't know, 20 years to get around to knowing them. But the point is, if you don't know what somebody's talking about, and just ask, like, because we don't really realize that we're doing them. I mean, now I'm putting myself in that group because now I use them. Briefly, because I think I'm running out of time, I will just give you a few pointers in terms of meetings. Everything I've said about interactions, of course, applies here. The thing about meetings I want you to remember is that you have to speak up, which is, I know, hard. You have to contribute, because if you're in a meeting in the US and you don't contribute, first of all, you're not going to be as valued member of the team. And importantly, if you disagree with something, people are going to think if you don't say anything, it's agreement by default. So you can't go after and say, oh, but I don't agree with that. Well, but you didn't speak up. That's what the response you're going to get. So you don't agree, you have to speak up. And then I'll just say that follow-up is key. Do it fast. If you summarize the points and the next steps, people will love you for it. Well, I had some pretty good stories here about negotiation, but I don't know. I don't think I have the time.
Yes.
Should I take it?
Oh, yeah.
All right. All right. Fun. Okay. So the point here is that really it's negotiations. It's good to know the culture, but you really are going to need local help, because this is more tricky than even other situations. But so let me just give you a couple of stories. So there was this American businessman from, I don't know where he was from, but had a negotiation with a counterpart from Saudi Arabia. And so they're talking about, all the different things that need to be addressed, and they agree, and it's going pretty well. And towards the end of the conversation, the American says, okay, this is great, so I'm going to do this, I'll send you this document, and then you'll talk to so-and-so, and so he recaps the way we do. And there's this long silence. And the gentleman from Saudi Arabia looks very offended, and indeed he is. He said, you don't believe me? You don't trust me that I'm going to do what I said I would do? And that was the end of that business deal. So culture, important. The other story that I find really interesting is this lumber liquidators story, and this is kind of to illustrate that you really need to have a local who's going to be able to see all these subtleties. Lumber Liquidators is a company that makes flooring and installs flooring in people's homes. And a couple of years ago, they had a recall. Recalls are no fun. When you recall a car, recall a kid's, toy, whatever. When you recall somebody's flooring, it's really, really not fun. So this was a big issue, and it's still going on now. Lawsuits up the wazoo. I mean, it's horrible. So lumber liquidators sources their wood from all over the world. And in this particular instance, the gentleman was negotiating with someone from China who was prepared to deliver this batch of wood. And so the American sends the specifications, here's everything that we need, okay. And then says, well, can you do a little something on the price here? So Chinese counterpart is, all right, I'll give you whatever it was, 10% off something. Okay, little did the American know that when the Chinese counterpart said okay on renegotiating the price, in his mind, the whole contract was back on the plate. How can I reduce my price without changing something else, right? No magic. So some of the specs went out the window. The American didn't know that. He thought, okay, I got a good deal, but the rest is still valid. So the bottom line is there was formaldehyde in the wood, and that's how you had to rip it out from people's homes. And I'm not sure how lumber liquidators is going to survive this. So again, just very important to have someone there who would spot that and be able to guide you through that. In terms of negotiations, I would just say, check first of all with your international lawyer who will tell you what you need to make sure you discuss with your counterpart. But after you've done that, I would say really go and talk with your counterpart and go through all the operational points you need to discuss. Use it as an opportunity to build the relationship. It's a very good way to get to know your counterpart really well, work through some issues, and get some, practice in what will happen down the road. And then you can take it to your lawyers and they'll put all the bells and whistles on it. One of my last points here is getting to know your customer. The point being, you're going to have to adjust your product most likely. And if you don't, that's fine, but you should know exactly what you're doing with that. McDonald's does it. I don't know if you've been to those countries, but that's, so what do you think is in Finland?
Right word.
Yeah. And they also have a salmiakki flurry, which I did not taste, but I have a story here just briefly on knowing your customer. Target went to Canada, and subsequently they had to pull out with billions in losses due to many things. But just one of the little things I want to tell you about, which in terms of culture, is in the US, and I think I've seen in the windows here, people wear camouflage, themed clothing every day. I mean, as a regular piece of clothing. Canadians don't. They wear camo when they go hunting or fishing. So these kinds of outfits didn't really sell. And Target had they had to just, what's the word, do a huge write-off on that piece of clothing. There's many other examples, but I thought that was one of the fun ones. And then my last point is really, once you've gone through all of this, you get to know your counterpart through the negotiation, you have an agreement that is signed, then your teams are going to start doing the implementation, the rollout, and they've never met someone from the other culture. So really make sure that you have some training in place to help them get to know the other culture as well. All right, because you don't want to have your whole deal fall through because people are just fighting all the time. Believe me, I've seen a lot of that. So monitor. So my conclusion is, definitely you should come to the US to do business, because after all, every chance is a possibility. took this from one of your own guys. And even if there's challenges, we've seen there are some. You guys are well equipped because you've got this thing, sisu. So that's my spiel about cultural differences, and just being aware is the key.